Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Inside the Forbidden Palace, in the heart of Beijing, for more than 5 centuries lived thousands of women whose names were never recorded in any imperial annals. Purchased as children, confined behind walls, they would never cross again, consumed by a system built to erase even the memory that they existed. These are the 15 brutal facts that show what it was, in practice, to be a concubine in imperial China. Fact number 1, the father received silver and the daughter was inspected like a breeding animal. There was no selection. There was a sale. An official arrived at the village with precise physical requirements and a pouch of silver. The girls were presented in a line, sometimes at 6, 8 years old. The official inspected teeth, skin, proportions, and odor. The father received payment on the spot. The girl was not consulted. Those rejected returned home marked by a rejection that never disappeared. Those approved said goodbye to their families that same afternoon at the palace gates. No arranged visits, no return date. Most never saw their parents again, not because they died soon, but because the system prohibited departures without authorization, controlled all communication, and transformed family bonds into an inconvenient memory. The more attached the concubine was to her family of origin, the more vulnerable she became to manipulations by rivals who used that attachment as an instrument of pressure. The concubine did not carry only her own fate. She carried that of her entire family. A serious infraction at court meant that relatives outside the palace could be banished from the capital, lose public positions, or suffer direct reprisals. This additional layer of psychological terror was part of the system's design. She could not rebel, could not show weakness, could not make mistakes, because the consequences fell upon people who had not chosen to be there. For poor families, selling a daughter to the palace was a financial solution, sometimes the only one. The official's silver paid debts, fed younger siblings, kept the roof. This made the transaction even more impossible to refuse. The girl knew that her departure was the survival of those who stayed behind. To refuse was to condemn her siblings to hunger. To accept was to condemn herself to disappearance. The system was designed so that neither of those choices was truly a choice. Fact number 2, the feet were broken and bound from childhood, making escape physically impossible for the rest of her life. Shortly after entering the palace, the feet were bound with strips of fabric that broke the 4 smaller toes and folded them downward toward the heel. The process ideally began before the age of 5, when the bones were still partially malleable. The earlier it started, the deeper the deformation, and the higher the girl's value in the imperial marriage market. The binding lasted months of acute pain. The wrappings were tightened progressively, inch by inch, week by week. When loosened for hygiene, the feet gave off the odor of dead and infected skin. The girls screamed, begged for it to stop, cried through entire nights. The mothers who performed the procedure knew it was cruelty, and continued because they also knew what happened to daughters whose feet were not bound. Worse marriages, more poverty, less future. In adulthood, the feet were permanently deformed, approximately 4 inches in length. Less than the palm of a hand, the arch was destroyed. Walking more than a few yards caused intense pain. Running was physically impossible. It was not merely aesthetic, it was a calculated physical containment. A woman with bound feet could not flee the palace, could not hide, could not go anywhere that was not authorized in advance. Fact number 3. Inside the palace, there was a hierarchy of 8 levels, and entering at the lowest was equivalent to being invisible. The newly arrived concubine received a low-ranking title and was installed in communal quarters with dozens of other women at the same level. No private room, no belongings beyond what she had brought, no privileges, and no indication of how long it would take to rise, because the ascent depended on factors she did not control. The titles of the imperial hierarchy determined everything. Room size, food quality, number of servants allowed, access to a doctor, likelihood of being summoned. The empress sat at the top, followed by the imperial consort, first through 3rd-degree concubines, and at the bottom, concubines with honorary titles, who were essentially reserves never utilized. The distance between the first and last level was not symbolic. It was the difference between real power and silent death. Rising in the hierarchy depended less on beauty or intelligence than on money and connections. Concubines from wealthy families arrived with sufficient resources to bribe eunuchs, gift supervisors, and build alliances with consorts from higher levels. Those from poor families arrived with nothing, and remained with nothing. The system that promised equal access to the emperor functioned, in practice, as a perfect extension of the inequality that existed outside. Fact number 4, the majority were never visited by the emperor, and aged waiting inside the same walls. The imperial summons was controlled by eunuchs who carried a book with the names of all available women. The emperor turned a card. Concubines who did not bribe the eunuchs simply never had their card turned. Decades could pass. The emperor died without knowing their names, and they aged, waiting for a summons that would never come. There are records of women who entered the palace at 11 years old and died at 70 without ever having been summoned by the emperor. Entire decades spent in communal quarters, performing the same ritual tasks in the morning, waiting in the afternoon, sleeping alongside the same neighbors at night, no family, no prospect of leaving, no purpose beyond availability for a man who never came. Aging in the imperial palace was one of the slowest forms of disappearance the world has ever created. The psychological isolation was meticulously constructed. Family visits were rare and controlled. Correspondence was read by supervisors before delivery. The concubine only had access to women within the same hierarchical level, and those women were her direct competitors. Genuine friendships existed, but they were risky. A friend today could be a rival tomorrow, and any information shared in confidence could be transformed into an instrument of destruction. Time inside the palace had a specific quality of torture. It passed with deliberate slowness. The days were structured by rituals empty of meaning, waking at the designated hour, performing formal offerings, attending ceremonies with no real function. The routine was not comfort. It was a constant reminder that the years were passing and that the life that could have existed outside was being consumed within walls that nobody had asked to enter. Fact number 5. The principal wife had legal authority to have her whipped, restrict her food, and use her as a personal servant. The oppression did not come only from the master. The imperial consort or principal wife had legal and social power to physically punish the concubine, order her whipped, cut her rations, and command her to serve as a personal maid during periods of punishment or simple displeasure. It was a power that required no formal justification to be exercised. Low-ranking concubines were obligated to serve the high-ranking ones, who served the principal consort, who served the empress, who served the emperor. It was a chain of institutionalized humiliation where each woman exercised over the one below her the same power she suffered from above. The result was a system of uninterrupted mutual surveillance. Every woman had incentive to report, humiliate, and punish the one below as a way of demonstrating loyalty and competence to those above. A common tool for eliminating rivals was the fabricated accusation. Concubines from higher levels, or eunuchs bribed by them, could present to the empress evidence of improper behavior, disobedience, or disrespect. Since there was no formal defense process, the accused rarely managed to defend herself before the punishment. The system did not require proof. It only required an accuser with sufficient credibility and an accused without sufficient allies. The physical punishments were varied and documented. Whipping on the back, palms of the hands, or soles of the feet, chosen according to the infraction. Confinement in a dark room for days or weeks. Rations cut in half. Prohibition of personal religious rituals. None of these punishments needed to be communicated to the emperor, who rarely involved himself in the internal dynamics of the harem. The principal wife and the empress had total authority, and rarely felt the need to explain their decisions. Life inside the palace was constant surveillance without pause. Servants reported behaviors to supervisors. Supervisors reported to higher-ranking concubines. Eunuchs observed everything and sold information to the highest bidder. There was no private space, no unmonitored conversation, no moment of rest from the performance of obedience. A concubine who displayed excessive sadness, anger, or nostalgia for her family of origin could be punished for lack of decorum and loyalty. Fact number 6. Becoming pregnant was the greatest victory, and the greatest threat to her own life. Pregnancy transformed the concubine into an immediate target of all rivals above her in the hierarchy. The child, if male, could inherit the throne. This made the mother a threat to the power of any other woman who aspired to the same for her own son. The logic was simple and brutal. Eliminating the pregnancy was far easier than eliminating a child already born and registered. Higher-ranking concubines bribed eunuchs or servants to add abortifacient substances to the food of pregnant rivals. Some of these substances were imperceptible in taste, herbs and roots that caused gradual internal hemorrhaging that resembled spontaneous miscarriage. The court doctors who attended high-risk pregnancies knew what to look for, and were sometimes bribed not to find it. A pregnant concubine without allies was, in practice, a woman in permanent danger. There were documented cases of newborns suffocated shortly after birth by corrupted servants, before paternity could be formally registered. The killing needed to occur within a specific window: after birth, before official registration in the imperial book. After registration, the child became property of the court, and any harm to it was a crime of high treason. Before, it was merely a small body that disappeared without questions. To survive the pregnancy, the concubine needed to build alliances quickly, with eunuchs who controlled access to food, with doctors who could identify poisoning attempts, with high-ranking concubines who had an interest in her success for their own reasons. Each alliance cost money, favors, or information, and each alliance created new vulnerabilities, because allies could switch sides when the calculations of power shifted inside the palace. Childbirth itself was another window of maximum danger. Court doctors were summoned to attend high-titled concubines during labor. Those of low rank relied on less experienced midwives in more precarious conditions. Maternal mortality was high and convenient. A concubine who died in childbirth did not need to be eliminated by other means. The system produced enough death through neglect that direct murder was necessary only in the cases of greatest threat. Fact number 7. If the child survived, it was registered as the child of another woman, and she was forbidden from raising it. Imperial law determined that children born to concubines be officially registered under the name of the principal wife or the empress. From a legal standpoint, the concubine had produced a child for another woman. Her biological contribution was legally irrelevant. She was the surrogate of a system that never used that name but functioned exactly that way. The separation began immediately after birth. The baby was handed over to wet nurses, designated by the empress or consort who claimed it. In some cases, the biological mother was used as a wet nurse, breastfeeding her own child, but forbidden from demonstrating any maternal bond beyond the functional. Servants observed and reported any excess of affection, touching too much, crying when putting the baby down, trying to prolong contact beyond what was necessary. Everything was noted. The child grew up treating the empress as mother in all public and formal contexts. Visiting the biological mother frequently was interpreted as disloyalty to the established family order. There are records of adult sons who publicly scorned the biological mother, not out of genuine resentment, but as a calculated demonstration of loyalty to the legal mother. The concubine lived to see her child grow up calling another woman mother and treating her with the indifference the system demanded. She was the mother who could not be called mother. Imperial protocol determined specific terms for children to refer to biological mothers in formal contexts, distant titles that marked the difference in status with cynical precision. In public ceremonies, the son greeted her with the same formality reserved for any concubine of her rank, and she responded with the correct bow, without showing what she felt, because showing it was risky and forbidden. Fact number 8. Concubines were executed in silence, thrown into moats and wells without record, without investigation. The most brutal punishment was not recorded in the imperial annals. Women considered inconvenient for knowing too much, for threatening the child of another, for having crossed the empress on a matter of power, could simply disappear during the night. The palace was large enough for a body to vanish without anyone needing to explain anything. The oral chronicles record eunuchs saying on the morning after a disappearance that the carp ate well tonight. The moat surrounding the forbidden palace was wide, deep, and sufficiently distant from the inhabited wings so that screams would not carry. The women who were thrown into it rarely survived the impact. No official record documented these deaths. They were simply absences on a list that nobody verified carefully enough to notice the pattern. The most documented case is that of consort Zhen, the favorite concubine of Emperor Guangxu. In 1894, she was publicly whipped by order of the Empress Dowager Cixi, a humiliation rarely applied to consorts of her level. The official reason was interference in political affairs. The real reason was that Zhen supported reforms that Cixi was blocking and had growing influence over the emperor. The punishment was designed to humiliate, and the whipping before witnesses was only the beginning. After the whipping of 1894, consort Zhen was confined in an isolated cubicle inside the palace, 2 years alone, forbidden from seeing the emperor, her own sister, or any person besides the servants designated for her custody. No correspondence, no ceremonies, no access to a personal doctor. The confinement was not a temporary punishment. It was a slow elimination that kept the body alive while destroying everything else that made life bearable. In August 1900, as foreign forces advanced on Beijing, Cixi ordered the flight from the palace. Consort Zhen was 24 years old. Before departing, Cixi sent a eunuch to throw Zhen into the well of the rear courtyard, while Emperor Guangxu watched powerlessly, unable to intervene. The body was only retrieved 2 years later, unrecognizable, covered in moss and sediment. The well still exists today in the Forbidden Palace and bears her name. No other memorial was built. The well of consort Zhen is visited by tourists every year at the Forbidden Palace. It is a narrow opening in a wall of ancient bricks, too small for anyone to enter willingly, large enough to receive a body thrown by force. The guides tell the story in a neutral tone, and what they rarely mention is that this well was not the exception. It was simply the case that survived documented. There were other wells. There were other bodies. Few have names. Fact number 9. Concubines in disgrace died slowly in the cold palace. Remote wings without heating where neglect was the official punishment. Punished concubines were transferred to these wings far from the main quarters. Beijing's winter reached temperatures of 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The rooms had no heating. The blankets were whatever the concubine could manage to bring. The daily ration was calculated to maintain the body functioning at the minimum biological necessity. The isolation in the cold palace was absolute. Visits were forbidden. Correspondence was censored or simply not delivered. The woman lived in the company of servants designated for her custody, generally the least experienced because the good servants had better prospects available. Months could pass without contact with any person who was not a palace functionary, fulfilling a formal obligation with no personal interest in her well-being. Consort Gong was transferred to the Cold Palace after losing imperial favor in the 19th century. The records describe a woman who cried so constantly and intensely over months and years that she developed severe chronic eye inflammation. Eventually she went blind, not from a diagnosed disease, but from accumulated physical damage from continuous crying in conditions of poor hygiene and without adequate medical treatment. She went blind from loneliness and waiting. In periods of crisis, wars, plagues, scarcity, the palace carried out silent purges. Low-ranking concubines had their rations cut until they died. There was no formal execution, no announcement, no record. It was starvation administered as a cost containment policy. An accountant identified how many mouths could be removed without political impact, and the cut was made. The women simply stopped receiving enough food until the problem resolved itself. The most disturbing characteristic of the purges is that they functioned in total invisibility. The women who starved to death in the Cold Palace had no birth record, no entry record, and no death record in the imperial annals. They were numbers on ration lists. When the number stopped appearing, it was crossed out. The space was assigned to another. Their belongings were redistributed. Nobody declared the death because nobody had declared the existence. Fact number 10, palace doctors did not attend low-ranking concubines. Illness was a silent death sentence. The court doctors were high-status functionaries designated to attend the empress, the emperor's children, and consorts of superior title. For the rest, there were midwives and servants with basic knowledge of herbs. The distinction was rarely explicit in the regulations, but in practice it functioned as triage. The level of treatment received determined who lived. Infections in the bound feet were chronic and frequently fatal. The process created permanent wounds where the folded toes compressed the tissue. Without antibiotics and with limited hygiene, bacterial infections set in easily. Gangrene was documented. The treatment was herbs applied by untrained servants. The result, frequently, was sepsis, a generalized infection that killed within days in a woman whose body was already weakened by years of insufficient nutrition. Tuberculosis swept through the communal quarters with devastating regularity. Dozens of women sleeping in rooms without adequate ventilation, with insufficient nutrition, and immune systems compromised by chronic stress. It was an ideal environment for the disease to spread. Once diagnosed, the sick concubine was frequently isolated not for treatment, but to protect those of higher rank. The isolation accelerated death. It was, in practice, yet another form of silent removal. When a low-ranking concubine died, her belongings were redistributed within hours. The space was assigned to another. The servants were reassigned. No mourning was observed by the others. Protocol did not provide for ceremony for low-title deaths. Death was treated with the same efficiency used to replace a broken utensil. The speed of replacement was, in itself, a statement about the value attributed to that life within a system that had purchased, used, and discarded it. Fact number 12. The master could sell or transfer the concubine to any man, and in the warlord era, they were distributed as spoils of war. Within the imperial and later republican legal system, the master had full right to transfer a concubine as a diplomatic gift, debt payment, or reward to an ally. She was not consulted. The new master could be older, crueler, poorer, irrelevant. The transfer was a transaction between men. In the warlord era, between 1912 and 1949, this practice occurred on an industrial scale. Concubines of defeated military chiefs were redistributed to the victor as part of the spoils of war, along with horses, weapons, territory, and gold. A woman who had spent years building alliances and surviving in a specific harem woke up, after the defeat of her master, in a completely new situation. Without any of the protections she had taken years to build. General Zhang Zongchang was the most extreme example. He had so many concubines that he admitted not knowing the exact number. Estimates reached into the hundreds. There was no formal hierarchy. There was only a man with absolute power and a compulsive accumulation of women as a demonstration of military status. Foreign correspondents who visited his harem described improvised structures without privacy, women without registered names, and a system that did not even pretend to simulate organization or purpose. Among Zhang Zongchang's concubines were white Russian women, refugees from the Bolshevik Revolution, who arrived in China without resources, without documents, and without protection. With no alternative for immediate survival, they ended up in his harem. Women who had grown up in middle or upper-class families in Tsarist Russia, who spoke French and read Tolstoy, became the property of a Chinese warlord through pure historical contingency and lack of any viable alternative. The transfer between masters was irrefusable for multiple simultaneous reasons. Legally, the concubine had no legal personhood to contest. Practically, she had no means of escape, especially with bound feet. Financially, she had no resources of her own because any money accumulated within the harem was subject to the master's authority. And psychologically, she knew that any resistance could mean immediate punishment without anyone outside the palace knowing or intervening. Fact number 13. With the death of the emperor, those without children were sent to Buddhist convents, never to leave again. When the emperor died, the fate of the concubines was determined by a single variable: did they have adult children with influence or not? Those who did could, in theory, be supported by the son. Those who did not faced two exits: the convent, or permanent confinement inside the palace with no function, no status, and no hope. Being sent to a Buddhist convent was not mercy. It was another type of prison. The women were sent with minimal belongings and a monthly pension corresponding to the last title registered at court, usually the lowest in the hierarchy. They had no choice about which convent. They could not leave, they could not marry, they could not return to the secular world. The convent was the storage facility where the palace placed the women it no longer needed, but also could not simply abandon. Those who remained in the palace after the emperor's death lived in a form of suspended existence. They had a title, but without an emperor to serve, the title meant nothing. They had quarters, but the new emperor's palace was not their palace. They were institutional ghosts, present in the records, irrelevant in practice, sustained by bureaucracy because formally dismissing them was more complicated than simply letting time do the work. The pension received after the emperor's death was calculated based on the final registered title, which rarely rose much above the initial one for the majority of concubines. It was sufficient to not starve, insufficient for any basic comfort. There was no adjustment for length of service, no recognition for children given to the emperor, no compensation for decades lived within walls without choice. It was merely a fixed number that remained the same until death. Technically, concubines became widows upon the emperor's death, but it was a widowhood without the rights the term should imply. They could not remarry, they could not have relationships, they could not leave the system that had consumed them. The emperor's death freed them only in the most abstract sense possible. The owner had vanished, but the cage remained intact, and the women inside it remained forbidden from leaving it by any choice, genuinely their own. Fact number 14. If the son was deposed, she was executed along with him. The concubine who had survived decades inside the palace, the purchase, the hierarchy, the eunuchs, the separation from her child, could lose everything in a single imperial decree. When a prince was accused of treason or conspiracy and removed from the line of succession, the biological mother was not spared. She was part of the crime by definition. The execution came without formal trial. The case of Prince Yinreng, heir of Emperor Kangxi, is the most documented. Deposed in 1712 under accusations of unstable behavior and conspiracy, his removal dragged along consorts and servants associated with his circle. Women who had never participated in any political decision were executed for proximity. It was not punishment for an act committed. It was preventive elimination of anyone who could claim a bond with the fallen prince. The logic of the system was direct. The deposed prince was still someone's son, and that someone, while alive, was a permanent political risk, a rallying point for factions loyal to the son, a symbol of legitimacy that survived his fall. Executing the mother along with the son or shortly after was closing the line with efficiency. The palace treated maternal loyalties with the same seriousness it treated armies. This created a specific terror in the mothers of ambitious sons. The more the son ascended, the more she ascended with him. More rooms, more servants, more food. But the more he ascended, the larger the target he painted on both their backs. Mothers of pretenders to the throne lived in permanent and irresolvable anxiety. Rooting for the son's success was rooting for a gamble where defeat cost her own life without recourse and without warning. The cruelest part is that she had no control over any variable of this equation. She did not choose the child she bore. She did not raise him. The system forbade it. She did not influence his political decisions. Access was controlled by eunuchs. But when he fell, the system that had kept her separated from the son her entire life reconnected her to him in a single moment, that of execution. It was the only time mother and son were treated as the same person. Fact number 15. The Republican law of 1929 locked the concubine in the house by decree, and the system was only abolished in Hong Kong in 1971, without reparation, without names. The Kuomintang Civil Code of 1929 stipulated that the concubine only had the right to sustenance and legal protection while she remained co-residing with the master. Leaving, for any reason, including fleeing abuse, meant automatically losing all legal status. The trap of the 1929 legislation was elegant in its cruelty. It purported to protect the concubine by guaranteeing sustenance while she remained in the master's household, but at the same time made voluntary departure a form of legal suicide. The woman who fled physical abuse lost the legal right to housing, sustenance, and any property accumulated during the relationship. To remain protected by the law, she needed to remain in the situation that made it necessary to leave. Concubinage was not merely an imperial tradition, it was a common practice among the middle and upper classes of Republican China. Merchants, civil servants, doctors, men with sufficient resources kept concubines in separate apartments or in the same residence as the principal wife. The popular culture of the era romanticized the subject, presented the rivalry between wife and concubine as natural drama, and rarely showed what happened to the concubine when the master's interest shifted to another. The concubine had no right to independent property while in the relationship. Any money she received from the master was considered sustenance, not salary, not personal property. Jewelry, clothes, furniture, everything belonged to the master. If the relationship ended, by death, by transfer, by abandonment, she left with what she carried on her body. The system guaranteed total economic dependence as a containment mechanism complementary to the geographic containment of bound feet. In mainland China, concubinage was formally abolished with the Family Code of 1949. It was a real legal advancement, but implemented in a society where millions of concubines were still in active relationships, and the state did not have the resources to guarantee individual protection to each one. The abolition was declared. The situation of women within specific relationships continued to depend on the master. The law changed. The daily reality of each woman changed only if he allowed it to change. In Hong Kong, the legal code of the Qing dynasty remained in force until 1971. While the world debated civil rights and watched lunar missions, Hong Kong still operated with legislation on concubines written for another civilization. The final prohibition arrived as a quiet reform, without ceremony, without recognition of the women the system had consumed. Concubinage simply ceased to be legal, and nobody asked what would happen to those still in active relationships on that date. When the prohibition came, there was no reparation. There was no recognition of the women the system had purchased, confined, and discarded over centuries. There was no process to identify the names lost in the imperial records. There was no compensation. There was no official memory. Concubinage ceased to be legal, and the stories of the women it consumed were buried along with it, as if the abolition of the law also erased the responsibility for the history it had produced. The names of the concubines survive only fragmentarily in the historical records. The court annals recorded titles, not birth names. High-ranking concubines appear as Consort X or Noble Lady Y. Those of low rank appear as numbers on ration lists. Those who died without a relevant title, without an influential son, and without a notable incident exist today only as statistics estimated by historians working with incomplete and deliberately lacunose documents. Contemporary Chinese popular culture remains fascinated by this subject, but from the wrong angle. Television series romanticize the rivalry of the harem, transform systemic cruelty into entertainment, and present the women as agents of their own destinies. It is a precise inversion of what the records show, that the system was designed to have no winners, that every woman who rose stepped on others, that any victory was temporary and did not alter anything of the structure that had produced it. The Forbidden Palace in Beijing receives more than 15 million visitors per year. Tourists photograph corridors, gardens, and halls built and maintained with the forced labor of thousands. The wings of the Cold Palace do not appear on conventional tourist maps. The architecture survived intact. The stories of the women who lived within it survived only in dispersed and partially verifiable fragments. The system of Chinese imperial concubinage was not an isolated cultural anomaly. It was an extreme variation of structures that existed in different forms in practically every civilization that concentrated power in the hands of a small number of men. The scale and duration of the Chinese model made it unique in the available historical documentation. But the fundamental mechanism, using women as a renewable and disposable resource, did not need any specific culture to exist. Modern historiography is slowly recovering fragments of these stories: family documents, eunuch diaries, ecclesiastical records of convents that received concubines, intercepted letters that survived in colonial archives. What emerges is a mosaic of names, dates, and circumstances that allows the reconstruction, with care, of some of the lives that the system had designed to erase. Each recovered name is an argument against the idea that the past was inevitable. In the end, what the system of imperial concubinage demonstrates most clearly is not the cruelty of a remote period. It is the efficiency with which any structure can function when it combines economic dependence, physical isolation, psychological terror, and legal legitimation into a single coherent architecture. The palace was extraordinary in scale. The mechanism of control was ordinary enough to appear, in smaller versions, in any society that decided that certain people did not need a choice. In the end, the system lasted centuries, not because those who inhabited it were extraordinarily cruel, but because it was built to perpetuate itself without needing the cruelty of anyone in particular. It was the system that produced the result, and each person within it fulfilled their function. The women it consumed were not victims of a historical accident. They were the fuel of a machine designed with precision, and the machine ran long enough for their names to be lost.